National Federation of the Blind. Live the life you want.
Hi, my name is Anil Lewis. I'm the Executive Director of Blindness Initiatives for the National Federation of the Blind, the most transformative membership organization of blind Americans. The unemployment rate of blind Americans has hovered around 70% for decades. The root remains the fears and misconceptions that people have around the capacity of blind people and the lack of knowledge around the tools that blind people use to be competitive every day. Through this series, we hope to educate both blind job seekers and employers about the variety of different careers that blind people are actively pursuing today and the tools and strategies they use to be competitive on the job. We're hoping that this will help put a dent in the unemployment rate and create greater opportunities for blind people. So let's take a look at where the blind work.
The National Federation of the Blind advances the lives of its members and all blind people in the United States. We know that blindness is not the characteristic that defines you or your future. Every day we work to raise expectations because low expectations create obstacles between blind people and our dreams. It is our collective power, determination, and diversity that achieves all aspirations for all blind people. And with that, I would like to welcome you all to our Where the Blind Work webinar, where we highlight blind people working in different professions to really show the capacity of blind people and really shatter those misconceptions. My name is Nikki Jackson. I serve as the Employment Program Coordinator for the National Federation of the Blind. And this is a special edition of the Where the Blind Work that is being hosted by our Center for Excellence in Nonvisual Access, where we will be highlighting professionals who are working in the field of access technology. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it along to our moderator, Kennedy Zimnick.
Great, thanks, Nikki. Hi, everyone. My name is Kennedy Zimnick. I'm an access technology specialist here at the National Federation of the Blind, and I'm going to be help moderating today's webinar. So I'm going to be going through a list of questions, and then our panelists are going to be answering them, hopefully giving some very great insight into working in the access tech field as a blind person. Karl, did you want to do a quick intro?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Karl Belanger. I'm a non-visual accessibility analyst here at the NFB, working in our Center of Excellence in Non-Visual Accessibility, along with Kennedy. I've been here for a little over 10 years, 10 and a half, and I've been working in access tech for a few more years than that, so about 14 or so.
Hi, everyone. My name is JJ Meddaugh. I come from Michigan here in Kalamazoo. I have been in access technology for a bit over 2 decades now, I would say, in various capacities, and started a company called AT Guys in 2008 where we sell access technology.
And I'm Corbb O'Connor. Pronouns are he, him, and his, from St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm a director of accessibility advocacy at Level Access. So I've been working on our thought leadership team here for the last 2.5 years and have been in the field of digital accessibility for the last 15.
Great, thanks, guys. Why don't we go ahead and get started with our first question. So Karl, why don't you go ahead and start with this one? How did you first get involved in access technology? Was it a personal need, a professional opportunity, or something else?
Certainly. So since I've been blind since birth, I started with technology and computers at a very young age. I still remember my first Windows 3.1 computer running DOS and the vocalized screen reader, which was an old DOS screen reader back in the day, and I took to computers pretty quickly. And over the years, I kept staying involved in access tech, from using a Braille-like note taker through college, working in accessibility, reporting issues to developers and things like that. And then it was kind of a natural progression after college. I started doing some accessibility work, doing some freelance and contract stuff. And then I ended up here working at the NFB, doing testing, working with vendors and manufacturers, and doing everything related to access tech.
Great, thanks. JJ?
So I guess my interest in access technology started when I was a kid, 7 or 8 years old. I had several loves as a child. two of them being technology and Braille. And we all know when it comes to Braille, the amount of Braille material isn't always plentiful. So I had a Versa Braille, which going about as far back as Karl did, old Braille display note taker, but a lot heavier than the ones that we have now. This was back in the late 80s. And I had one of those in third grade. When I was done with classwork, somewhere in my desk was the Versa Braille manual, which I thought was fun reading material to kill the time in between, doing classwork or things like that, or maybe even during classwork sometimes. So doing things like that and having an Apple IIe computer in our house was probably what first got me into having an interest in technology, and then later on tearing apart and building computers. I would say professionally, it probably started while I was in college. I knew I wanted to do something with tech. I wasn't sure if I wanted to do a career or just kind of dabble in it, but I ended up doing a lot of side projects in college. One of them being Blind Bargains, which was a news site, deal site that was pretty popular for quite a long time. And that's kind of what got me into, and that dovetailed into doing AT Guys later on.
Great, thanks. Corb.
Yeah, so I don't go back, I don't think quite as far as these guys, but my Mac LC was my very first computer. And I think the thing that got me interested in Access Tech was when I was 8, I started building websites with Netscape Composer and eventually Ultra Edit and Dreamweaver, and really didn't know what I was doing with assistive technology. I wasn't using a screen reader at the time, and I'm sure what I built table layout websites was absolutely atrocious for accessibility. But nonetheless, that was my intro into it. And so in college, as I started to go through various programs, I started to be the one that people pointed to figure out how to build the website. After college, I ended up kind of stumbling into a career of business to business consulting. So I was doing a lot of web development, design of sites using WordPress and Drupal, and writing content, creating videos. But eventually realized that what I really liked to be able to do at the end of the day was to point back and say how an experience was meaningfully different, or what did I create? And digital accessibility was the way that I was able to showcase what was different, or what was kind of like a carpenter can look back at the end of the day and say, I started with raw materials and now I've got a finished product. And so I started up US Bank's accessibility program, and was the first person really to have that role, and stumbled around for quite a bit in those early years, just trying to figure out how do we handle accessibility at a large enterprise that hasn't before focused on digital accessibility. And so then from there moved on to several consulting roles, and now really focus on how do we make sure that we're helping businesses realize the revenue side of accessibility more so than just it's a cost center or it's a legal risk.
JJ, we'll start with you on this one. What is a tool or device you rely on daily that most people outside the community don't even know exists?
So I was trying to think of the direction to take this question, because there are a lot of tools. And one of the big things that I try to do is, if I find myself doing something over and over, then let's find a tool to do it quicker. As an example, I got into doing a lot of calculations and things like that, and found the Windows calculator not to be, it's not terrible, and it's actually gotten a lot better now. But I found a tiny little utility called Calcute, Calcute, which essentially is Notepad meets calculator. You can type in equations or math problems, whatever, and you press enter. And when you press enter, it'll solve whatever is on the previous line. So I like finding little utilities like that, because I really try to go with the notion, the idea is there's got to be a way to do whatever it is that I need to do. I try to do as much as I can using the technology that is out there, and just try to find cool and interesting and efficient ways of doing things. Another quick shout out as well for an app that some people may have heard of now called Pickybot, which is PICCYBOT, which is an app on iPhone and Android that lets you get descriptions of video. But one of the really cool things that they've done that I think might not be as well known is you can actually send them a YouTube link or a video link on WhatsApp, and they will come back with a description of the video right through WhatsApp, which also means you could use it on your Meddaugh glasses if you wanted to do that.
Yeah, Corb.
So one of the things I've used at my kind of to JJ's point of utilities and taking something that you repeat a task and finding a way to script it. Siri shortcuts on the iPad, now just called shortcuts, is a really powerful tool. I think a lot of people know it as one that you can program and say, you know, brush my teeth, right? And when you tell it that, it's going to give you the weather and it's going to start a timer and it's going to turn your lights on and, do those kind of activities. It'll do all that and that's great. But at my last job, what I was actually able to do was, and I had never worked before with an API, which is really kind of think of it as the code experience of working with an application. So there were several tools we were using that weren't super accessible with a screen reader, but they had an open API. And so what I did is use the Shortcuts app to prompt me with some questions, and then I was able to push those results through code back to the applications that our company was using. So I didn't have to go through an inaccessible graphical interface, but was still able to get the work done, and sometimes even faster than my colleagues, because it was very much based around my workflow. And so, it would ask me questions about who's this project, who's the customer, who's going to be working on it, how many hours will it take? And we were able to upload that then back into our time tracking tool and into our project management tool, and even into an Excel spreadsheet. So it put all that same information in the places that I needed it, in a really accessible and quick way. And building those workflows was really straightforward on the iPad.
Yeah, Karl.
Sure. So one feature I use more than you might think is the kind of OCR and document reading, image reading features that are now being built into screen readers. JAWS and NVDA both have it on Windows. iPhone has their image detection feature on iOS. Android, now you can describe an image or describe the screen with Gemini. And these are really useful in a number of ways. Sometimes I'm testing and I encounter an unlabeled image that I suspect may have text in it, or it could be a menu or part of an inaccessible application. I use them all the time in my personal life to enable me to play various video games that aren't otherwise accessible. And related to that is the kind of newly coming out AI image description features like Picture Smart and JAWS. Well, these won't develop an alt text for an image on their own. If I'm testing and I come across an unlabeled image, I can potentially give it to one of those and get some feedback as to what the image might be, and potentially be able to provide some recommendations or things like that.
All right. Yeah, we'll move on. Corbb, can you share a time when your lived experience as a blind person helped shape or improve a project you were working on?
I think that one of the biggest things that I've discovered about digital accessibility has been the experience of bringing both the blind user's experience and a low vision user's experience together. I think a lot of times when we look at applications and we look at websites, we are really singularly focused on the screen reader experience. And there's a large group of folks who call themselves blind, myself included, who still have some residual vision, some who still use that to navigate a website. And so a lot of times it's the kind of thing where we'll be looking at a website and we'll say, well, for a screen reader experience, we can move this content around, around in the order of elements so that it makes sense for a screen reader user. But for a low vision user, it might still be just as confusing. So if we have a form that we were working on, right, and the submit button was in the top right corner of the page, that's visually maybe how it looked. We could make that experience work great for a screen reader user and move that button magically to the bottom of the form, and then visually reposition it. But a lot of times it's about saying, hey, as a screen reader user, I wouldn't expect to fill out a form and then have to go back to the top to submit it. And so we went to the design team and said, hey, this is kind of a goofy layout for everybody when you really think about it. Your visual focus is going to be at the bottom of this form. The submit button's nowhere near that. Why don't we just move this button for everybody? It makes the screen reader user experience better, it makes the cognitive experience better, and it makes the low vision user's experience better. I think a lot of times when we think about accessibility, we think, oh, color contrast, that's for low vision people. Keyboard order, that's for people who can't use a mouse. Headings, that's for people who are using screen readers. And really, we need to think about accessibility holistically and think about one solution that works for all users.
Yeah, that's a great point. Karl.
Sure. So, as part of my work here at the NFB, I do wear a number of different hats, and a lot of, a good chunk of what we do is advising members of the NFB. They'll call us up, ask us questions about different tech, and being able to share my experience with different technologies and kind of lessons learned and things like that is always pretty important. Also, when we're doing testing and working with employees or working with different companies, I should say, it's often useful to give stories of when I've experienced a certain issue or how an issue may affect me, or even for someone who's new to screen readers, uh, being able to share experiences and potential issues that a person new to screen readers may have is also important. And especially whereas in addition to the testing work in my earlier days of Access Tech work, I did training and various other things. So making sure that things are usable for both the advanced and beginner users, very important to me.
Great. JJ.
Yeah, so I think one of the big things that I notice is when I am able to work with people in person and they see how fast and efficient a blind person who uses a lot of technology can be. So they've been doing their testing and it's, they're used to the screen reader on the default setting. So it's really slow and they're going through it really slow because they're testing it. So it might work, everything, the app they're working on might work great in their testing. But the challenge is they've been doing testing it in a really slow environment. So they really haven't anticipated someone who's trying to power through the app and breeze through the app. And when they see someone like myself going through the technology, they have a different perspective of how things happen. I was using an indoor GPS product and they just weren't anticipating someone who wanted to use tech fast and also walk fast at the same time. There you go. Anyone who's listened to podcasts, there's the train that always comes through. And it's still here now. So just being able to realize and understand that people that use technology, we want to use it efficiently and as fast as anybody else that's trying to use their product.
Karl, what are the biggest misconceptions you've encountered about blind people working in tech?
So one of the biggest misconceptions that I encounter frequently is companies or employees not realizing the capacity of blind people and the capacity of screen readers, or really even knowing how this stuff works. And they think that uh, either blind people don't really use computers or that accessibility is hard or complicated. And there's still a real lack of knowledge about all the accessibility pieces and just how much of it can be included in your workflows if you do it while you're developing the projects.
Yeah. JJ.
So I think one of the ones that comes up for me, and we are just as guilty as blind people of thinking this as anybody else, is we will talk to a blind person that's working in tech, like, oh, you work for Apple, you're for Microsoft, what do you do? Are you in the accessibility team? And I think making that assumption that a blind person that works in tech wants to or is in the accessibility part of the company. I know several blind people who either intentionally or just because what they landed, they are in other parts of the company because maybe they just don't want to deal with accessibility. Not every blind person wants to deal with accessibility, and that's totally fine. And I think just as much, if you are that blind person working at a company, hopefully you're not becoming that default. The occasional question is one thing, but if that's not your role in the company, if you end up turning into the accessibility expert, but you weren't really trying to do that job, I think that's a thing that happens a lot. And we are, like I said, just as guilty of assuming that other blind people that are getting hired are also getting hired in accessibility roles.
Corbb?
I think people with disabilities are often looked at in organizations, to JJ's point, as the one who can be the accessibility tester, and also as one who is seemingly kind of always on fire and upset about digital accessibility. And what I think people misunderstand is that when we go home at the end of the day, we're still facing inaccessible technology at every turn. And so when we come to work and the business makes a business decision about where they're going to spend their time, their energy, or their focus, and it's not on improving that experience, so we're going to launch this inaccessible thing and we're going to come back and fix it later, it's difficult for folks who are disabled to say, okay, we understand that's a business decision, and just kind of, here are the risks, here are the opportunities, and just move forward. What we have is a personal vested interest in making sure that technology is more accessible than it was yesterday. And so while we recognize that we often have to make those business decisions, it's also not something that we get to turn off at the end of the day. And so the fiery frustration that we often bring to work around digital accessibility is not because we're frustrated with our peers or because we're just angry people, but it's because those decisions that the company is making are ones that affect us even outside of our work hours, particularly with similar products or even with products in other industries that we're using at home.
JJ, so what's one thing developers, designers, or companies always seem to overlook, but that make a huge difference in access?
So I think a lot of it can be distilled down to UI, user interface design, and back to that efficiency word again. So there are certain designs for apps and websites that we know as blind people can just be really effective. But often, and it's a sad thing because I, of course, know that we need to make the web and apps accessible, but there are some companies that through their efforts in trying to be WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, trying to make their websites and apps compliant, they've actually made their sites worse because now they're being too verbose and trying to be overly explanatory, doing things like as you're typing into a box, an edit box, it tells you every single character, 2 of 50 characters, 3 of 50 characters. Stop it. Like, this is not helping, it's making things worse. So I think sometimes it's coming back to the basics of UI design and making things efficient. Thinking about, of course, we'd rather hear OK button than button OK. It seems very minor to maybe a designer. They would never think of it until we tell them, no, we're trying to tab through this and be quick about it. We want to hear the changing information first. And I think the other related thing to that is the time from key press or swipe to when you actually hear feedback. And a lot of people, again, if they're new to access tech, they will press a key and they'll hear a screen reader speak a half second or a whole second later, like, oh, it's working because it's talking. Like, no, that is horribly inefficient and not really doing anything. And it's not a product that I would enjoy using.
Yeah. Corbb?
JJ, you're so right about the countdown timers. The NASA website is one I was using the other day, and I'm no longer able to really use it because it's counting down the number of seconds until the next space launch, which I'm sure looks cool, but literally unusable. But I think that the biggest one that I see a lot of developers and designers making is they're using assistive technology while they're visually looking at the screens. And so if you think of something like a carousel of images, they will say, well, yeah, the previous button is labeled, the next button is labeled. I click next, and then it read all of the content of the page. But what we would say is, well, okay, but it should read when I click next, it should take me to the content that is now being displayed. Or if I'm in an app and I click on this row of a budgeting application and up pops a panel from the bottom with 4 or 5 options, my next swipe shouldn't still be inside my budget. It should actually be in that newly available content. And what they do is, I think a lot of developers and designers, right, is they double tap, they say, great, it opened, and then they tap on the new thing that they expect that a blind person's going to want to use and discover that everything's labeled. But that order of swipes or that order of elements is really important to us. And I would add to that, similarly in the mobile application world, a lot of times people are developing their own custom keyboards, particularly when it comes to numerical inputs or to pin entries. And so what that means then is if I'm a Braille display user, if I use Braille screen input, or if I have my keyboard set in a certain way where all I have to do is drag my finger over the keyboard till I get the right number and I lift up and that types the number, on these keyboards that they have custom built, which is just a series of buttons, I have lost that efficiency of digital accessibility that I've come used to in the application. So anything I might have changed about how my keyboard looks or how it acts using all my different assistive tech features is lost. And so that can really impact my ability to move through that application with the variety of tools that I'm bringing into it that otherwise a text field would have solved this problem very quickly, easily, and far less expensively for the developers.
Great. Karl?
Yeah, so, JJ and Corb both brought up really good points and examples, and I think it all kind of ties back into one of the biggest things I notice is that developers and companies underestimate the true impact of having accessibility be part of the thought process from square one. They, we had a company a few years ago that we were working with, and we flagged some color contrast issues. And they're like, well, unfortunately, that's the colors our marketing team gave us, and they've already printed a massive campaign for this company that's using this color scheme. So we really can't change it for a while. And that kind of just was an example of where, sure, getting the accessibility for the code is one thing, but it's also the user interface designers. It's also the visual designers. It's um, potentially content editors, things like that. And really, accessibility, if a company does it from the very beginning, can make such a huge difference and make sure a lot of these pieces that can be overlooked or be bolted on at the end get caught and addressed when it's much easier to address them rather than trying to retrofit later.
Yeah, that born accessible is very important and saves companies a lot of time and money and headaches. Okay, Corb, how do you stay on top of evolving tech, and what excites you the most about what's coming next?
From an evolving tech perspective, I think what I try to do is keep an eye on the things that are being developed by the mainstream tech vendors, and then think about how is that going to affect digital accessibility. So when we look at things like the WWDC keynotes from Apple, for example, let's take a look at kind of what are the patterns, what's the big picture of what they're trying to accomplish. And then we can talk about how you technically make those things accessible. But what we start to see are things where we say, oh, people want to feel more connected with the glass of their device. They want to have more light and animation. Certainly, those are things that we can say as users, okay, yeah, we can have an option for people to turn off or to be more transparent, to be less transparent as people are using them. But I look at those kinds of experiences and say, okay, what is it from an accessibility perspective that can give us a similar feel? And several years ago, right, that came with haptics. So the idea that when I touched my phone and pushed a button, it actually kind of felt like I was pushing into the glass. And so we could say, hey, maybe when we're now using our phones to take a picture of a check that we're going to deposit, what are some fun ways that we can use haptics to kind of showcase to somebody that they're getting close to the image, or it's getting farther away from the image, or that it's getting blurry? Can we use haptics to do that? And similarly, now that we're starting to look at Apple's liquid glass, right? What are the things that we can be thinking about that have a corollary to that in the non-visual world? And I will say I haven't quite figured out what that is yet, but I think thinking about how we make it so that there can be as much interactivity, as much animation and smoothness of transition as there is for sighted users, how can we bring that into the world of access tech so that when my screen reader moves from one application to another, right now, there's not exactly any kind of sound or any kind of animation to that. It's just my cursor starts in one place and I Alt tab and it picks up in another place. But are there things that we could be thinking about that make that transition feel smoother for a screen reader user as it is the way that we're doing it for a sighted user visually?
Yeah, very interesting point. Karl?
Certainly. So I am always interested in evolving tech and new developments, everything from podcasts and YouTube videos, reading articles. Sometimes I'll find new software that's under development and give it a try, or betas of things. I've done some beta testing in the past, and that's always a lot of fun. As far as what's coming next, recently been very immersed in this area of AI. And I think AI has a ton of potential to re to kind of change the landscape for access technology, but there's a lot of people who are kind of looking at it as a magic bullet or a fix all for technology issues. And AI, again, is a tool in the toolbox. It can help to identify some things. It can help with image descriptions or video descriptions, but it's not some, you know, cure all that's going to fix all technology needs. Uh, Companies have been talking about, doing AI in web browsing and other things. That may be good, but do you want your AI helping you on the checkout page of a site if that AI is going to be using your browsing data for training? Or, do you trust the privacy policy of it if you're, say, entering your credit card number or need help on your bank website? So I think there's a lot of potential there, but there's also just people need to be careful and temper their expectations a bit where this goes.
JJ?
So I'll throw out a couple. There's certainly a lot of different things that I look at. Probably a big one for me as far as tech news and news in general with everything going on is Reddit, which just has thousands upon thousands of forums, and it's a great way to kind of keep up with what's happening in news, because you can sort by new or best, or different ways to kind of get a snapshot of what is going on. You can really hone in on very, very specific things. I also want to shout out Blue Sky, which is really kind of an up and coming as far as a social media network. Mastodon is cool for certain things, but it certainly has become a bit of a blind bubble, unfortunately, for what it is. And there's a lot of good resources, especially in AT, that are on there, but it's not a great representation these days of the mainstream. It just hasn't caught on the same way that others has. And Blue Sky might be one of those possibilities for a network that's gaining some more popularity. Bski on Windows and Skeets on iOS are a couple ways to get at that accessibly along with the website. As far as what I'm excited for in the future, to tech on to Karl, yes, I'm definitely an AI guy, knowing the pros and cons of it. Specifically, I think the Meta glasses have shown us what could be possible. There's a lot of things that do not work well with the Meta glasses. They don't describe things well. They don't like describing anything that's personal or people or any number of other things, and they don't give us the level of detail that Be My AI or other AI tools might. But I think they show what's possible with video. The Giga glasses, the Echo Vision, I think have a lot of intrigue surrounding them. They're coming out later this summer, so that could be a really interesting one to look at. And I think understanding that live AI, so what we've learned is, okay, we thought live AI was going to be ready to go But what we have now is what I'd call live on demand. In other words, you can ask the AI, hey, what do you see now? What do you see now? But it's kind of like poking your friend who's sitting next to you at the movie theater when you don't have audio description, and having to remind them every 30 seconds, what about now? What about now? Because the live is kind of more like we have a live feed, but it's not going to tell you things unless you ask it to. So that next step is going to be a true back and forth live where it actually can be watching and then come at you with some new information when it sees it. So that's what I'm looking forward to in AI.
And I think
Great.
I'm
All
looking
right.
forward on the AI perspective, right? I'm looking forward to AI being far less human. And that is, I think, maybe a counterpoint to what we hear from most people out in society, right? They like the idea that AI can sound natural, can really be like their friend. And what I'm finding that I want is an AI that I can say, no, I don't want any of the fluff. I don't want any of the interpretation. I want you to just purely give me description of what's happening. And I think to JJ's point of your friend at the movies, right? They get sometimes they're describing to you and it's great, and then they go, oh my God, that is so cool. I can't believe they did that. Like, what are you talking about? Right. And I think that from an AI perspective, what I want is one that doesn't forget that its job is only to give me data. I'll do the interpreting, thank you very much. But I want it to be even more succinct, and don't really care if it even uses full sentences. I don't care if it sounds like a human. I'm used to hearing Jaws all day long at 450 words a minute. I can handle faster. And so I'm looking forward to AI maybe having some alternate experiences where we're all not using the same voice and the same engine, that the same experience. We're using the same engine, but we're not all using the same voice. We're not all listening to it in the same way, but it's getting to know what kind of data do I want as compared to maybe what JJ wants, and giving us different ways of accessing that.
All right, Karl, what barriers still exist in the access tech field, whether it's in hiring, development, or user testing, and what needs to change?
So I think one of the biggest issues is still educational. There's still not nearly enough accessibility best practices and reasons for accessibility included in college level and even lower, high school, middle school, computer science, computer programming, or web design classes. And I think that's still a big shortcoming because then people get into the business world and they're expected to make accessible products and do work with the WCAG guidelines, and they have to learn that from scratch. Whereas if it was included in some of their school curriculums, then that would be, they would have that knowledge going in and things would be a lot smoother. Related to that is there is still a lot of issues with higher level, C-level, management level buy-in at companies. We still experience companies where there's a core group of people who care about accessibility, champion accessibility, but then as they get promoted, move on, whatever, the people who follow them don't have that same passion, and then the accessibility of that application or that website can fall off, and things can go back to where they were before, or potentially even worse. And the best way to fix that is to get accessibility included as part of the core requirements for projects, as part of the reviews for employees, as part of the training. And that requires buy-in at the highest levels.
JJ?
So I think I'll focus on some of the tech tools surrounding being a business owner that works in technology, and we use a ton of technology tools. And of course, as a business owner, I can choose the accessible ones, but our choices are often limited by what's out there. You will notice sometimes a lot of apps or websites say, yeah, we've made our app or website accessible. And you look, okay, you've made your customer facing part of your app accessible, but the back end, there's no way. For instance, if I wanted to, as a blind person, create an accessible DocuSign, thing for someone to sign, signature thing, I do not believe there's an accessible way for me to do that right now. There's definitely not lots of ways to create good PDFs, and PDFs are just the bane of many people's existence in the first place. A lot of back-end customer service and support software. There's enough that we can able to find things that are accessible, but again, we're limited by choices. So I think it's finding companies that do a good job to create those accessible tools to really recognize what can be possible. There's a really good company called Olark who does accessible chat software as their mainstream and also accessible. And they saw the potential, the market potential for making sure that their front end and back end customer service chat software was accessible. And I think we need more companies like that to kind of really make it so blind people can be a part of all access, all parts of the business and not just the front end and user facing parts.
Right. Corbb.
Yeah, plus one to that, JJ, of companies making one side of their application accessible, but not the comprehensive side of things. I think also from the usability testing, we hear often that companies say, oh, we want to do some more user testing with people with disabilities, and setting aside that we're not testing users, we're testing technology. So it's usability testing, not user testing. But nonetheless, right, that we want to think about the experience of disabled users as an integrated experience. So if I'm running usability studies every single week on my product, rather than saying, oh, that's right, I need to do that disabled study, I need to do a study of blind people, there's value in bringing blind folks together and saying, what is the common thread about how blind people want to interact with my app and experience? Because we're going to bring maybe a different perspective and an innovative way of looking at how to solve something, right? We don't necessarily want the bar graph versus the pie chart, but we want to get the data in different ways. Maybe we want to present it through sound. Maybe we want to present, it's more important to me that I understand the top level of how this data is represented. And so it's less about the graph and the visual, and it's more about the hierarchy. But nonetheless, right, if we're running these usability studies so often, then why aren't we just bringing a blind user or a user who only uses a keyboard or someone with low vision into every one of our studies? I would hope, never say, well, we're going to run a usability study of all people of one race. And now, oh, that's right, once or twice a year, I'm going to run a study of people with a different race and see how they use my app, right? No, we would say, let's bring all their experience together into one study. And so similarly, I think that we're not seeing organizations really approaching accessibility in a way that says, what is the common thread among all of our users? You may find that sighted folks, we say, well, sighted folks are coming in, have this experience, blind users have this experience. We don't want to necessarily be in the state where we're finding, using that testing to find accessibility bugs. What we do want to say is, what is the common thread? And what we often find is that the things that make the experience better for blind folks and people with low vision is going to be improving the experience for everybody. It's not like our feedback is usually wildly off from what other typical users are expecting.
Hey, JJ, do you think access technology is still too reactive, building around existing systems, or are we starting to see more innovation that's born accessible?
I think the pendulum is starting to swing back towards being a bit more proactive. So going back to those early days of screen readers, Karl mentioned Vocalize. I used Tiny Talk, which I think was one of the more obscure ones. The early days of screen readers, late 80s, early 90s, people were building, there was no less than for younger people, this might seem a bit crazy, but there was probably about 8 or 10 different screen readers that one could pick from at the time on DOS and then Windows as well. And people tried different ways of making things accessible because there was no accessibility tools. They couldn't just ask the Microsoft software to say, hey, what's on the screen? They kind of had to figure it all out. And that led to a lot of different innovations, many of which are still live in screen readers now, the way that we interact with the screen. And then for about 20 years or more, JAWS and NVDA, especially, and Windows when it was around, became really reactive. Like, oh, there's a new version of Windows that's not accessible yet. We got to spend all of our resources to make sure Windows 7 can work or Windows 10. or the new version of Office, and of course the web, as the web was advancing. And the original ways we interacted with websites was you would load the web page and it would just sit there and you wouldn't get any updates. And of course that doesn't work anymore either. So it was just really reactive, trying to keep up with that type of stuff. I think now that some of that has stabilized, you are starting to find some more innovation again, both through the screen readers themselves and some of the add-ons and scripts that are available. So figuring out the JAWS multi-line Braille approaches are interesting, and and for all screen readers, that's a really new one that we kind of start to get to think about something new again. How can we make multi-line Braille more useful than just let's just display 4 lines of text in a row? Should we have 3 lines of text in a status cell on the bottom? Should we have status cells on the right side? Or, can we do a table? So it gives you an opportunity to innovate and try to think of some things a little bit differently than what we've done in the past. So I think we're starting to see that Apple and Google now also are kind of pushing each other a little more towards some newer types of making things accessible, and that's becoming really interesting as well. So I think we're seeing more of it than we have in a long time.
Corbb?
I think that to JJ's point, I think we're starting to see more of a mainstream look at accessibility, and we're starting to hear more developers talking about accessibility and the things that they're bringing in from the operating system level. But where I'm not seeing much innovation is in the area of desktop screen reader accessibility. So folks who are sighted have long been using 2, 3, many more monitors. And yet, as screen reader users, we're still stuck in the world of looking at one line at a time. There's been some advancements recently where you can have some split Braille on your Braille display. But from an audio perspective, how neat would it be to have 2 keyboards, right? And have one keyboard controlling, a cursor and content in my left ear, another controlling cursor and content in my right ear. We're pushing, that would really push the bounds of what we're able to do for screen reader users to really give us a functional version of that multi-monitor experience that sighted folks have had for, several decades. And so the ability to maybe say, hey, I'm in a document with my right ear, but I'm, participating in a Teams chat with my left ear, so that I can quickly bounce back and forth without having to adjust, an alt tab between these experiences. I think it would take some getting used to for us as users, but it would really start to, once we have that level of technology, we'd be able to really, I think, make some meaningful progress with what is it that we can be doing. And so instead of looking at things like, oh, I can, query the system to do a thing for me, I would want it instead to be able to have more control myself over, hey, I want to be in 2 places at the same time, which, sounds a little bit like Harry Potter, but gives us the chance to, be in a position where we're really competing at the same level as our sighted peers. And I think that what I look to is the organizations that are building screen readers and assistive technology and saying the reason that folks continue to purchase their tools is because for years we've gotten used to that being the only way that we would have access. Now we're seeing more and more access come from the operating system level. iOS and Mac OS were kind of the ones that pioneered the idea that your operating system brought with it a lot of accessibility right out of the gate. And we can all kind of joke about narrator, and maybe Windows Narrator isn't the most beneficial screen reader. But at the same time, it's getting close enough that I think without that innovation, companies that are making the assistive technology are really going to start to see their revenue decrease if they don't start innovating and creating that real reason that we should spend extra money to get something remarkably better than what I can get from the operating system itself.
Karl?
Certainly, yeah. I agree with kind of some of the points raised that, in the areas of desktop screen reading and even some of the mobile stuff, it's fairly status quo and haven't seen a ton changing. But I think in some of the areas of emerging technologies like the smart glasses, first we had the very expensive ones like the Orcam, the Envision glasses, but now we're seeing the Meta glasses. It was referenced earlier, the EcoVision glasses that are coming. Google's Android XR glasses, and so many others getting into the space, and the embracing of some of the accessibility aspects, like the image descriptions with the cameras and audio, 3D audio positioning potentially for GPS devices. There's an app called Microsoft Soundscape for a while that did some of that. Again, the multi-line braille, the new Monarch display is pretty interesting, and I'm excited to see further developments in that. And then, got to mention this because it's my personal enjoyment, is gaming access. Nintendo Switch 2 just came out with Nintendo's first screen reader. It's still not that great from what I hear, but it's a start. Companies are developing more audio cues and thinking of how to do blindness related interfaces for gaming. One of the big notable ones last year was Forza Motorsport, which provided the first AAA developer racing experience for totally blind users with audio cues, turn descriptions, etc. So there's a lot of innovations coming in some of these newer, more emerging areas of technology. And even just for developers of mainstream devices, like I mentioned, Nintendo finally is adding a screen reader. Uh, all the big tech companies are continuing to develop the screen readers in their devices. And I hope we see more developments in that area. And I think one of the areas we should be pushing for developments in is some of the more consumer electronic devices that have screens. Think thermostats, appliances, other consumer electronics, things like that, because that is an area that still lacks a lot of accessibility.
Corb, what is the biggest piece of advice you have for students interested in a career in access technology?
The thing that I think is often lacking when it comes to folks that are applying for roles in access tech and digital accessibility is clear communication. So much of what we do is in writing, especially when we're communicating with offshore development teams or third-party design firms. And so the ability to very quickly, succinctly explain what is the issue, what are you expecting, how do you recommend we address it, are really important. And so while you might not be writing, prose in the likes of Tolstoy and Shakespeare, you nonetheless need to be in a position to be able to write and punctuate really well. And it's something that we've started to rely, I think, really heavily on verbal communication and on AI to address for us. But the students that are coming into the field who will be able to clearly communicate verbally, confidently, but also be able to write eloquently and quickly are going to be the ones that ultimately succeed in this profession.
Okay. Karl?
I think for me, it's, one piece of advice I would give is just to really, get to know your technology, be able to work with it, and find the area that of access tech that is interesting to you. Because a lot of people think of the web accessibility developer. You're going through the WCAG guidelines and developing, testing the software or the website for accessibility. But accessibility is so much more than that. It can be advising companies and marketing as far as for the user experience, the user interface experience. It can be, the programming piece, the QA piece. There's a number of different pieces. So find what's interesting to you and really dive into it. And there's a lot of opportunities out there, a lot of things that intersect with accessibility beyond just the standard testing path, and really just explore the opportunities and go with it.
JJ?
So I think when it comes to figuring out what you want to do as a career, it's really easy to say, I'm an accessibility consultant and put that on a business card, but you have to have some experience or some reason that I would hire you or somebody would hire you in that role. So it might not be paid projects at first. It might be doing something small, and I want to separate that. I don't want to suggest that you spend hours upon hours and weeks upon weeks volunteering your services, because your time and your expertise is worth something. So, don't just be giving it all away for free, but realizing that you might want to start smaller and, maybe find a local nonprofit or a local store, say if you want to get into web accessibility, and help them with their website. And you could charge them a few $100s or $1,000 as opposed to a big ticket accessibility contract, and get your feet wet doing these smaller projects. And you can kind of learn what works and what doesn't. You can develop systems and the tools that you want to use for testing, figuring out which tools work best for accessibility testing. And that's if you're in that area. Like Karl said, he's absolutely right. There's so many different things that you can be doing. And it's not just web accessibility. While there's lots of companies looking for that, that is just one area to deal with. We realized this, I think, even as we were building this panel, and Kennedy and Nikki, and then we're building the panel, is, access technology. Well, we have access technology here where we do a lot of consulting, and we do a lot of, looking at websites and apps. And that is quite different than being an access technology instructor, teaching blind or other people about access tech. That's a quite different type of field. So also figuring out, what is it that you actually want to do in access tech? Do you want to teach people? Do you want to help people make their websites better? There's a lot of different ways that you can go.
Karl, in the same vein, what would be the biggest piece of advice for people wanting to make a career change to access technology?
Yeah, so my biggest advice for people wanting to change careers would be to start thinking about, again, a lot of the previous advice applies, but also, how can you start getting into some of this in your current job? If there are accessibility issues with the software you're using, maybe consider raising them with your employer and starting to have some discussions of how these things could be improved. What other areas of the job could intersect with potential access tech work? What training might you want to get on access technology or accessibility testing? There's things like DQ University and many other online training courses if testing is the field you want to go into. If you want to go into training, what other online courses or things might you want to take? Volunteer work. Are there people in your life or in your community who you could start helping with some technology issues if you wanted to go into training? And just don't be afraid to explore, try new things, see if there's ways you can engage with access tech in your career.
Great. JJ.
So Karl makes some great points there, and I think really covers a lot of what is really important. It's really about having connections, and having that portfolio out there that you can show people what you've been working on, whether it's a side project or whether it's just, having a lot of lived experience that you can share with others. Getting yourself out there. If you really want to be in access tech, then getting yourself to a tech conference or two that involves that can be really helpful. CSUN, for all of its faults, it's still the largest conference that deals with web accessibility and apps. So if that's what you want to do, try to get yourself to one of those. And by the way, you can go to that conference without paying the hefty registration fee. You can go and just do all the networking and exhibit hall, which is free, and other things like that. But there are other events like that in different parts of the company. There are web accessibility meetups in various cities. If you go on Meetup, you can find people. Maybe there's one in where you live. There's the AT NYC conference coming up in October. Lots of opportunities to meet people. I will say a lot of the side gigs, for lack of a better term, consulting gigs that I've picked up over time have been from a conversation that started at one of these events. And of course, you can do this at a national blindness convention as well. So you could do this, at NFB at the convention. Sometimes those conversations, get out there and go to the various meetings, and also, but talk to people before and after and learn what they're up to. And maybe, you never know, you might find a really interesting connection that could be fruitful.
Great. Corbb?
I think the piece that I would say is is twofold. One is to think about why it is that you want to enter the field of digital accessibility. I think often I hear from people who are searching for the right career path for themselves, and they say, I want to make some good money, and I guess I'm blind, so I can do digital accessibility. And if that's the motivation for you, and that is where your skill set lies, more power to you. But I think a lot of times, when it comes to digital accessibility, think about, do you really like looking at broken things all day long? Do you like explaining to people why they should think about the disabled user's experience? Do you like digging into code and talking to designers and drawing and creating and being an artist? And do you like talking with business folks and explaining to them how blind people actually have a good amount and people with disabilities have a good amount of disposable income, and we are very loyal customers and we bring revenue to the business?
Over and
If
over.
That's right. Absolutely, we are repeat customers, right? Because think about it, 96% of the homepages out there on the web are not accessible. When we find the 4% that are, we don't like change. And I think that what I have found in my career has been that a lot of the work we do can be really frustrating, but it can be rewarding when you find the people that are the designers and the developers who didn't know better, but once they learn, they want to do better and really help them in that and mentor them in that journey. If that interests you, accessibility will be a great fit. But I think you also have to keep in mind, that there is definitely a lot of misunderstanding of our field. I had somebody at an NFB convention come up to me and say, "Oh, you're working in accessibility? Gosh, I wish more blind people would get like real jobs." And it occurred to me after that conversation that I said, wait a second, don't you want to be able to open your app at work and find that you can do your job easily and efficiently because somebody's thought about the keyboard shortcuts and the screen reader experience and how that design works when you magnify the print size? To me, that's a real job, but it's very much a pushing against the grain. In our recent State of Digital Accessibility report, we found that only 1 in 5 people who responded to our survey said that their organization understands the connection between revenue and digital accessibility. Now, that's a little higher for those who had, a policy and somebody accountable for accessibility, but it's not by much. It's only 10% more for that. But we find is that when we can bring in that lived experience of us as blind users into that conversation, and we showcase that we are at this meeting not because I'm the token blind guy, but because I have the understanding of how I'm going to one day talk to a developer, the next day to a designer, the next day to a product leader, and the next day to the CEO. When I can have that lived experience throughout a week and bring that into all those different formats with the right tone and the right messaging, right, we can make a real meaningful difference.
So JJ, when have you felt truly empowered by the tech you were using or helping to build?
So it's a really good question. I was trying to think of a good answer. A lot of the tech that I've helped build is just kind of been, it's really cool, I guess, to see when you directly talk to a developer to get a change made in an app or a website. And a lot of times it's a small little change, but now that app or website is going to be used by other people. I think one of the areas that I've been focusing on lately, because it can impact a lot of websites and apps, are plugins. So we use Shopify for AT guys, WordPress just as well has a million different plugins and add-ons that can be installed to add different functionality to the site. And if the developer of that can make their plugin accessible and make sure it works well, then that's a whole bunch of websites that suddenly got a whole bunch of accessibility all at once. So I kind of like these little wins, instead of trying to get the big win from the Fortune 500 and, working with them and making their big website. It's kind of cool when you talk to the solo developer and they'll come back 15 minutes later like, oh yeah, that's easy, I fixed it. And it's the little wins that kind of add up that really make me happy.
Corbb?
So a few years ago during the pandemic, the feds were going to start distributing COVID tests to all Americans. And the tests that they were distributing were not going to be usable by blind folks. And so where I felt really empowered was being a member of an organization in the National Federation of the Blind who sent a letter to Health and Human Services Secretary saying, hey, this is a violation of federal law. And, I kind of thought, oh, that's nice. We sent a letter, we made our point, but hey, these are like, these tests are cheap, they're plastic. Like, how are you going to make those accessible? And we sent a follow-up letter a few months later when there wasn't much action. And all of a sudden, there was a core group of people that were brought aboard within the NIH to say, let's make the National Institutes of Health, let's make COVID tests more accessible. And let's do it in a way that brings blind people and the lived experience of blind people and the manufacturers together. And let's talk about what would it take? What kinds of opportunities are out there? What are the things that we can do with swabs and instructions and plastics and packaging and QR codes and websites? And what does it look like to put all this together? And I'm really excited by the work that we were able to do, not just to affect that dozen or so tests, but the work that we did with a set of guidelines that's now available from the Access Board and soon from the World Health Organization. What started as one letter became the lived experience of blind folks and manufacturers and the federal government together. And even better, icing on that cake is the processes that we used working with that team were themselves also accessible. And so there were times where the team that we worked with at the NIH actually stopped and changed deadlines and said, you know what, we're not going to release this form because how dare we put out a form about accessibility that's not accessible? Hey, we have a process. We're going to have you reviewing slides. Let's make sure we change that process so that all those slides are accessible before we put them in the hands of our subject matter experts. That kind of commitment to say, we're not just doing performative accessibility. We're not just fixing websites. We're doing really hard work and work that's never been done before to think about how do you make these tests super easy to use for folks who are blind, people who have low vision, the elderly, and do it in a way that's itself, the process that we follow is likewise accessible. To me, it helped me feel really empowered that the work we do in the National Federation of the Blind makes a difference and can have a meaningful impact around the world.
Karl.
Sure. So what makes me kind of feel empowered is, again, when I see that developer who I started with, who had all the broken links and text,
National
elements that are
Federation of
just
the
text
Blind.
and no
Live
headings,
the life you want.
and then just to see that journey as they get it and as they come to go, from that initial start to a fully accessible site. That is one of the most kind of exciting and empowering things that I get to see, because then it really does show that there are companies out there that care about accessibility, that want to do the right thing. And a lot of times when we come across companies with accessibility issues, it's not from any lack of desire on their end or any real problem that they have. It's more just the designers didn't think of it, the developers weren't aware, the executives didn't realize the impact of their thing not being accessible. And so to educate and work with the company hand in hand to get them up to speed, get them to be more accessible is very empowering. And especially if we can do it in the right way, that there are processes in place, there are guidelines in their internal material, so that as it goes forward, they're going to stay that way.
Great answer. Okay, that brings us to the end of our questions. Now I just wanted to give the panelists a chance to give any final closing thoughts. If you don't have any, that's great. You guys have all been great, and we really appreciate your time.
This is Karl. I'll jump in and just say, we've covered a lot today. There are a lot of things to think about, a lot of opportunities in access tech. So if technology is your thing, if you're thinking of a career in the access tech space, whether it's testing, training, product development, whatever, go out there and explore. Take your time to evaluate things, try different things, do some personal projects. If you're in a job, like we said earlier, see if you can integrate it into what you're currently doing. But just do what seems fun and interesting to you. There's a lot of opportunities, a lot of different areas. So just go for it and enjoy what you do.
This is JJ. I think it comes back to, finding your niche and exactly what Karl said. Do what you love to do. And I know that's a generic advice that you might hear on any one of these webinars that comes up, but it definitely rings true in this field because, yes, as Corbb said, you can just be sitting in front of a screen and having to spend 90 minutes trying to troubleshoot a random bug, or some code, or trying to figure out, why is this web page not doing that? And that's, certainly part of it. Maybe you enjoy that, and that's awesome. Do that. If that is not your thing, but maybe there's another part of technology that you do enjoy. Maybe it's talking to people and showing them, maybe it's doing group trainings that you could, present. And maybe it's writing documentation where you're just kind of sitting around and you're writing documentation for the next cool piece of tech that's out there. There's a lot of ways that you can go. And just to also call back to before, access technology, yes, but there are so many careers in tech that are out there. You don't have to do access tech. If you want to do access tech, great. There is plenty of need for it, and I'd much love to have qualified blind people in those roles. But if you don't want to do that, that is totally fine. Do whatever type of tech interests you.
This is Corbb. What I would say is think bigger. So often with digital accessibility or access tech, we think about bugs and we think about, labeled icons, and we think about what is the keyboard interaction pattern of this element and what should the heading be on this page? And those are all really important questions. But I think where you can really have a meaningful impact in access tech is to think about what is the ultimate pain in the neck factor of using my technology on a daily basis. And those are the things that lead to innovation. And so if you find it really frustrating that, hey, in my banking app, I have to log in before I go to the transfer, and then I go to this page and I go to that page, and finally I can choose an account and enter the amount I want to transfer. Gosh, wouldn't it be better if I'm looking at my transactions list or my balance list and I could just be like, hey, move money, right? That's how smart assistants and voice assistants started. For a lot of financial services companies, is somebody was looking at the front page of the app saying, wait a second, this device has a microphone on it. I could add a button to activate the microphone right here. I don't have to have users click through all these things. Now that has accessibility implications. It's also just better for everybody and a lot better experience. And so when you can think of those innovative solutions and you find yourself saying, why can't they just do this? Why doesn't a solution exist that builds this way? You don't have to be the person who can write the code to make that happen. What companies really value is the person who can dream up what is the pain that the user has experienced. Let's prove that there's a lot of users that have that problem. Let's prove that they would be more loyal customers. There will be more customers for us to reach, that there's some kind of business connection there. Then we can put that in front of our designers and developers and say, build this. But it's that idea generation and the willingness to come up with 20 ideas and throw 19 of them away. That's what creates ultimate innovation. And that's what companies value most when it comes to digital accessibility.
Great. All right. Yeah. Thank you to all three of our panelists. We really appreciate it. And I just wanted to say, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more of this type of content, please let us know. Nikki, did you want to do a quick conclusion?
So thank you to all of our panelists, JJ, Corbb, Karl, for such an informative and engaging conversation. I know that our viewers have taken a lot from this conversation. I know I most definitely did. So thank you all for contributing to this discussion. And thank you to Kennedy for moderating such an informative discussion. And also thank you to our Center for Excellence in Nonvisual Access for hosting this event. So thanks, everyone.
National Federation of the Blind. Live the life you want.